Hi, these are Lance's Legends. Hit the subscribe button in the bottom right corner. I hope you enjoyed this story. I'm going to finish the Fort Canyon story I promised to update. Fort Canyon was formed when all of the glaciers that cut up the granite on the south side of Lone Peak's range deposited what's called a terminal moraine. It's a big pile of rocks and dirt and debris that the glacier pushed down the mountain. And there are two major hills. First Hamongog is about the 7,200 foot mark, and second Hamongog is about the 8,200 foot mark. Hamongog is a biblical word that means flat place. The perimeter of second Hamongog is covered with a beautiful, thick pine forest, and it runs to the west along the crest of the hill and parallels the range. My friends Pat Reese and Doug Porter and I had gone up there the winter before and made the mistake of trying to go down Fort Canyon in the winter. I was struck by the beauty of the canyon. It had dozens of waterfalls and cliff lines and all kinds of debris from avalanches, and it was just a spectacular canyon. So I decided the next spring that I would go up and investigate the canyon a little further. My friend Doug couldn't go, and if you watched the version of the winter experience, some people might question why I took Pat back up there with me, but I thought it being springtime and no snow in that part of the mountain that he'd be okay. So we got to the trailhead and started to investigate the path. Seems there was no path, no trail, nothing but thick trees, scrub oak, bushes, and a stream. The volume of the stream varied substantially. Sometimes it would be a roaring stream, and other times just a little quiet trickle with beautiful pools. There were mossy flows that came off the granite. There were all kinds of seeps and stuff that contributed to it, and then the regular snowmelt that came down the different tributaries to that canyon. So we started bushwhacking up this canyon, and it is a long canyon. It just runs straight east and west almost, and it comes up out of Alpine and works up a couple of thousand vertical feet, but it has steep sides and a lot of vegetation. And as near as I could tell, there had not been a lot of people ever go up or down that canyon. So it was beautiful. We came to areas where there were beautiful reflecting ponds in the stream, places where the quake and aspen were with their new leaves of spring just sparkling. It was a beautiful hike, but it was tedious. A lot of the time we had to walk right up the stream, and other times, especially at first, Pat was trying not to get his feet wet, and he was just fighting it. And like previous hikes with Pat, I had to wait a lot for him. I'd hike a while, and I'd stop, then I'd hike a little further, and I'd come to obstacles that I knew Pat couldn't maneuver around, and so I'd wait for him before I picked my way through them and listened to his comments and complaints about how short his legs were and how hard it was to climb over all these trees that had fallen down. And I told him, we were going to have a beautiful camp once we get up there to Second Hamongog. There's a beautiful spring there. And I'd hike for a while without him and then stop and wait. Or I'd hike a while and come to an obstacle and stop and wait. And then I'd help him maneuver through cliff lines and different things that would keep him from making any progress. As we got higher in the canyon, the sides were steeper and steeper and a lot of sheer granite. We had experienced the canyon the winter before, so I knew there were some substantial cliff lines especially up about 3/4 of the way up the canyon. So as we made progress, we finally had to just commit to walking right up the middle of the stream a lot of the time. And other times you'd have to leave the stream to negotiate around waterfalls. As we got higher, the scrub oak began to give way to pines and quaking aspen trees, and it's a beautiful canyon. It is beautiful. There's no sign of mankind there, and no trail, no path, no litter. It's just beautiful. The foliage, the flowers, the trees, it was just wonderful. As we got about 3/4 of the way up the canyon, we came to the waterfall that Pat and I had tried to cross when the ice collapsed, and we plunged into the pool. And this picture shows that part of the stream and the pool down below and the big debris field. And just underneath the waterfall, you can see a great big rock with a log leaning over on it to it. And that was in the winter, that was covered with snow, and it looked like just a big mushroom. And that's where we'd set up our tent after Pat and I took our cold plunge on January 1st. It was a critical situation, but we got Pat off the mountain safely. And I was excited to see these waterfalls. There was another waterfall that came off a big cliff line where I had suspended Doug off the edge and kind of let him free fall a little ways. It wasn't nearly as big a cliff, but the cliffs were beautiful. And as we picked our way up through these cliff lines, we began to see a lot of signs of cougars. You could see drag marks and hooves of deer and one elk, and the cougars had come down out of the cliffs and had grabbed an animal and then drug portions of it back to their dens. Later in the day, as we were climbing one cliff line, we came upon a really substantial cougar den. You could tell that a pair of cougars had spent the winter there. There was no bones to speak of, but there was plenty of other sign, as you can see in this photo. But we just kept following the trail, and I would leave Pat in the dust, and then I'd have to stop and wait for him. And I came through a stand of pines. The stream was off to the side, and it was opening up a little bit. It was just scrub oak and pine trees and quakies on the edge. And as I was walking along, all by myself, Pat was a quarter mile back, all of a sudden, a cougar jumped up, no more than 30 or 40 feet away from me. And it jumped up and looked straight at me, and then it bolted, and it ran up through the pines. And I have spent a lot of time in the mountains, and I'd never seen a cougar up close. I'd seen them a long ways away, in the winter on a ridgeline or in the spring, but I'd never seen one up close like this. It was startling, and I was surprised how this cougar just took off. I thought, wow, I must be uglier than I thought. So I stayed right where I was. I thought, Pat's not going to believe this. I thought, I'm going to show him right where I was standing. So I stood there and waited for 15, 20 minutes. And finally, Pat came up to where I was. And I said, Pat, you won't believe it. I was standing right here, and a cougar jumped up right, and let me show you how close it was. And I walked over, popped through some of the scrub, and went to show him where it was. And I looked down, and there on the ground was a newborn baby cougar. I said, Pat, come here. You won't believe this. And he came over, and I picked up the cougar. It's about the size of a house cat, maybe a small house cat. I said, take my picture. And I handed him my camera. I got all the settings right. It was an old Pentax Spotmatic, so you had to set the aperture and the focus and everything. the speed, and I got it all set, and I said, take my picture with this little cougar. And so I held it and said, there you go. And I could tell Pat goes click, and it was like he took a picture of my stomach, but not my head. I said, Pat, come on, take a picture of me. Look at my face. Make sure, look in the viewfinder. He goes, the cougar is going to come and eat us. And I said, no, it's not. The cougar's not going to come eat us. And I said, she took off. And I think she just had given birth to this little baby cougar, and they were just laying here in the sun. So Pat took another picture, because no one would believe this story without it. In the picture, you can see that the little cougar still has its eyes closed, and you can see its umbilical cord next to its tail, just on the side of the dark stripe of my shirt there. We put the cougar back right where it was, and then we climbed up to a cliff line that was off about a quarter mile where we could watch, and we sat for probably a half hour, and then we saw the mother cougar come back down and reclaim her newborn. It was quite an amazing experience. We finished our hike. We climbed up several waterfalls and through the stream, and then it began to open up into Quakies and a beautiful fern forest right below Second Hemingog. And when I saw those ferns, I knew we were getting close, because there's a big hillside covered with ferns and quaking aspen trees and pine trees just below Second Hemingog. So we followed the canyon all the way up and then set up and had camp. And then we hiked the rest of the way up to Lone Peak the next day. But it was quite an amazing experience. It's the only time I've ever seen a cougar up close like that in the wild. And it's definitely the only time I've ever held a baby cougar. And that's my springtime Fort Canyon story with the baby cougar. I hope you enjoyed that story. These are Lance's Legends. Hit the subscribe button in the bottom right corner. Thanks for listening.